but I wanted to cover some material today that I think you might find interesting. I'd like you to imagine, if you will, a hypothetical world, certainly nothing that could happen in this country, where a nation that is energy independent, that is a power economically, politically, and strategically in the world, somehow goes through an election cycle and there's a regime change and there's decisions made to, instead of being energy dependent, to become independent, to become energy dependent. So this regime begins with shutting down pipelines, shutting down coal-powered plants wherever possible, moving dramatically toward creating disincentives for the use of all carbon fuels, and doing so giving the argument that climate change is such an immediate problem that something has to be done literally within a 10 or 12 year period, thereby justifying changes that in the past would have never been thought of. And at the same time that this regime is doing this, they are competing with an international Asian power, China, that is actually ramping up its energy use on the back of the very fuels that we're running away from, especially coal. So China is developing its economic might at a time that we're devolving our energy independence. And at the same time we're doing that, we decide that now is a good time to roll out electric vehicles for all Americans. Not thinking that as we increase the use of electricity for private public transportation, that we're doing so at a time when the grid is actually beginning to become weaker and weaker. So what I want to talk to you about today is I want to talk to you about energy and the grid. It's specifically to point out the fact that we're moving in the direction of energy and economic policy that puts us at a disadvantage in almost every way internationally, strategically, in terms of economics, in most every conceivable way, and at the moment is contributing to much of the inflation and the difficulties that we're having now. I like this picture of the Green New Deal. It reminds me of going to Holiday Inn and having breakfast. You put the waffle mixture in the waffle, and you flip it over. And in just a few minutes, you end up with just goodness. So this picture kind of reflects for me what I think a lot of people in the other party believe that the Green New Deal is that we can just very quickly go from dark and dirty and industrial, which is what's on the bottom, to green and sunshine, and everything just works just beautifully. But the reality of it is that with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course doesn't reduce inflation at all, it's another version of the Green New Deal, what we've done is we've accelerated the degree to which we're moving away from energy independence and moving to energy, frankly, uncertainty. It's one of my favorite cartoons I've seen recently. You see, that's our boy Mayor Pete there, and he is pushing these electric vehicles. Some of you may have electric vehicles, and if you do, God bless you. I'm glad that you can afford them. But Mayor Pete's pushing this electric vehicle, and if you take a look at what's going on behind him, you see that it's being fueled by a coal plant. Coal still generates the bulk of the electricity in the world, and also in this country. Between coal and natural gas, the bulk of the electricity that we have that will fuel these come from that. Of course, it doesn't tell you that there's a sizable purchase expense for this, and that charging expense is not just at your home, but the mythical grid that we have out there that you stop on the interstate and charge your car on. It doesn't tell you about the dependence upon an aging and diminished grid, which is really the part of the major focus of what I want to talk about today. It doesn't talk about the fossil fuels that are fueling that. It doesn't talk about the rare elements and the minerals that are mined in countries, many poor countries, and in countries sometimes that are hostile to the U.S. that are used for the batteries for these cars. It doesn't talk about the issues of recycling. These are non-renewable resources. So there's an illusion around the electric vehicle that it's energy clean, when indeed it creates its own problems. There is no free lunch. Energy is used to create these. Currently, the bulk of our energy in America comes from carbon fuels, and this is all consumption: petroleum, natural gas, and coal are the major sources of fuel that we use. Nuclear plays a role, and we have 12% of our energy in America now is by renewables. That would be hydro, that would be solar, that would be wind power. If you take a look at this map, you see that the bulk of the electricity that was generated in June of this year comes from natural gas, coal, wind, and nuclear. Those are the top. The renewables, which are solar and wind, are smaller percentages than the natural gas and coal. Natural gas and coal still account for almost 60% of the electric power generated in the grid as of right now. And this picture here, this graph shows you that while there's a gradual increase in the use of renewable energy as a part of the mix, that we're still heavily dependent upon natural gas and coal, although coal plants are being phased out at a rather rapid rate. By 2050, it's anticipated, though, that from 16% renewables, which is what we're doing now, that we'll be up to about 42% renewables. Of course, the issue with renewables is the renewable energy works when the sun shines and when the wind blows. It doesn't carry base load in the middle of the night or in dark days. Now, I show you this because while we're devolving our use of natural gas and coal, using less and less of it, this is what China's doing right now. China is fueling its economic and military infrastructure on the backs of coal. And guess where they're getting some of that coal? They're getting it from us. We're one of the major exporters of coal to China. So this is part of the quandary I have about this public policy, which is why would we purposely devolve our energy capacity in America? Why would we purposely do that and at the same time help fuel the energy capacity of another country? Well, the myth is that China is also pursuing a Green New Deal, but there's no evidence that they're doing that at all. There's no evidence at all. In fact, just the opposite. It's like, okay, you agree to put one hand behind your back and go into a fist fight. I'm going to keep both hands free and get a machine gun and a knife. That's the kind of disparity that we're putting ourselves in here with this kind of deal. China's currently building over half of the world's new coal-based plants, over half being built in China. They're adding on the average of 33 gigawatts of power every year and have been doing so for quite some time. As of January 22, there was a total of 3,000 operating fire coal power plants in China. So as we're reducing our dependence and use of coal plants, they are increasing theirs. And here's a startling graph. This is coal consumption. If you look at the blue, the light blue and the dark blue at the bottom, that's India and China fueling their industrial might on the backs of coal, just coal alone. Over time, you're seeing that Asian countries are increasing their use of coal, of energy, and coal in particular for energy. At the same time, we're reducing ours or holding it, maintaining it. And the bulk of that, if you look at the green at the bottom, the bulk of that energy is not being used for residential or transportation. The bulk of it is being used for industrial. And in the case of China, a great deal of that is military. The grid. We talk about the grid as one thing, but the grid is some 3,000 plus entities involved with the grid. And the grid in America is old and aged. If you want to get a look at how old the grid is, if you take Dibble Road, you know this, Dibble Road between Mount Morenci, is it saying this right? And over towards Cedar Creek Church. If you, just before you get into Morenci there, on the right you'll see a really old electric grid system that looks about 30 feet tall. You know the one I'm talking about? It's metal. That thing dates back to the early 1900s. That's how old that is, and that's a functioning part of the grid. So parts of the grid are brand new. Some of them literally go back to the 19th century in some parts of the country. So the grid is not a brand new or developed thing. It is a mishmash of infrastructure across the country, some new and some really quite old. Now the grid is regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and it's regulated in that way because electricity is part of the interstate commerce. It crosses state lines. Under the Constitution, the feds have authority over it, and this is the agency that does it. But you also have state regulatory agencies, rate commissions that decide what your utility rates will be. And then you have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, when you have nuclear involved, which is a big deal here in Carolina. About 60% of the electricity in this state is produced by nuclear in South Carolina. So we're different than a lot of other states in that regard. We have the Environmental Protection Agency at the state and federal level. And in some states, there are state compacts between states that also regulate energy. So this is a highly regulated and complex industry. And then you have the providers. You have the investor-owned like Dominion and Florida Power and Duke. Then you have the consumer-owned like Aiken Electric, And then you also have vertically integrated units which are basically not producing power, but they're buying it and selling it. And then you have distributors, distribution only. And so the grid is made up of all of these entities that are buying and selling, producing electricity and moving it across states. To make it even more complex, the feds are involved with selling power too from dams, hydroelectric, and thermal sources across the U.S. And there's a map that just shows some of those federal power sources that are found throughout here. Now, electrical power markets. I wish Reggie were here, he'd appreciate this. You've got Eastern market, you've got the Western, and then you've got the Republic of Texas. Republic of Texas has its own power system, and I think that's, if you've ever lived in Texas like I did, Texans are just Texans. They don't really need the rest of the world. They're kind of entertained by what happens in the East and the West. There's the Canadians in the far north, and there's Mexico to the south. As long as they've got Texas, they're okay. But they've had trouble with their grid in the last few years. They've had some snowstorms and droughts and other things that have affected the grid. This is hard to see, but this is a map of what are called independent system operators and regional operators, and these are the people that run your grid. 60% of the electricity in America is managed by these RTOs. Here in our area, we're managed by the Southeast Regional Transportation Organization. And these are the people that literally are kind of moving the electricity across the bridge. By the way, does this look complex enough for you yet? It gets worse. Then we have something called the North American Regional Councils and Interconnections, also known as NERC. And this is an oversight body that tries to manage and maintain that energy is equitably distributed across the country, so that when California, like right now, they're having drought and their hydroelectric capacity is diminished a great deal, this is the organization that's working with those providers out there to get energy coming from the north or from Texas or other parts of the country there. So we have NERC. Major responsibilities are developing standards for power operation, monitoring, enforcing compliance, education, and this is the last one is big, investigating and analyzing the causes of significant power disturbances, of which we're having an increasing number over the years. Which brings me to coal. Now, some of you are going to read or hear that I'm a professor of environmental studies. So what in the name of God am I doing standing up here and telling you that we need to take a closer look at coal? It must mean I've drunk something before I got here, or smoked something before I got here, because any realistic environmental person would not be saying, you got to look at coal. But you remember that slide I showed you earlier about China? You can't afford in an international environment to have this particular fuel part of the world and put this nation at a disadvantage. So we're having to look at coal again, or should be looking at it. There's been a war on coal. You remember when Obama was elected, one of the first things he talked about was doing away with coal. Then we elected Biden, and who wasn't supposed to be part of the Green New Deal, but it turned out he was carrying the Green New Deal, and we have a serious war going on with coal. The reason coal is popular is that it's comparatively cheaper than other forms of energy, or at least historically has been. In these days, new energy that we're producing is principally coming from solar, it's coming from wind, and it's also coming from natural gas. Coal-fired plants are being transformed into natural gas plants in many parts of the country. Solar and wind are cheaper to put in than building a new coal plant, especially a coal plant that's involved with clean coal technology, which is where we're going to need to be going if we're going to use coal. And by the way, China is already pioneering the use of clean coal technology, so its use of coal is no accident. They're trying to do it in the most effective and efficient way that they can. We have reduced coal capacity. Each year we are closing coal plants and replacing them with solar. Let me go down here. Right now, as a general rule, if we put in 1 acre of solar panels produces about 350 megawatts of energy. If you look at the 12,600 megawatts of energy we're retiring this year from coal plants, it would take, what, 36 acres? 36 acres it would take about 36 acres of solar panels to replace that coal plant that you're retiring. And that solar field would produce power only when the sun is shining. It doesn't help you with the base load. So the deal here is when you shut down a coal plant or a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant and you replace that with solar and renewables, you don't have the same production capacity that you had before. And Reggie, who's not here, Reggie was reminding me that the other thing about those coal plants is if you look at coal plants across America, they are placed in close proximity to each other so they can help maintain the load and charge across the train. So when you close those, then you create a less capacity for generating power over long distances. So solar and wind are not equal trade-offs, megawatt for megawatt, of a closing of a natural gas, a coal, or a nuclear plant. Been a lot of changes going on since 2010 to 2020. Coal states like West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and I could go down the list, they're all dramatically reducing the amount of electricity they're using with coal to a great degree, especially in states like Colorado. They're replacing coal with natural gas. At the same time, folks in Washington are touting the fact that we have the ability to store energy. Our battery capacity has increased dramatically. As of this year, we have the capacity in the grid to store some 4,500 megawatts of power. The only problem is we use 11 million megawatts of power every day. 4,500 doesn't get us very far down the road. And here's the issue: the retiring of electrical plants across the nation. This year, some 12.6 gigawatts of coal-fired plants will be closed. Coal-fired plants will be 85% of all of the plants retired in America this year. By the way, this goes on year after year after year because this is an aged infrastructure, these coal plants. This is a graph that shows you, though in blue, the number of new plants that are being built. And if you notice right in the middle, right here, not building any more coal plants, we're just shutting them down. At the same time, coal exports are increasing. They've increased the last 2 years, and guess where it's going? It's going to China, India, Japan, South Korea. Those are the major sources. The Asian market is where our coal is going. So, for example, in Craig, Colorado, they shut down one of the most productive coal-fired electric plants in the West. And people said, well, what's going to happen to the coal mines around Craig, Colorado? Not a problem. They just mine it, they slurry it, they ship it out to the West Coast, and they send it over to Asia where it's burned there. And it's not burned as clean in those plants at this point as it would have been if it were burned in an American plant. Colfax provides much needed affordable electricity throughout the world. 37% of the world's electricity and over 70% of world steel is produced by coal. I mean, we don't think about that, but we need coal for steel also. So coal serves more than just an energy purpose. It's the largest single source of electricity and will still contribute 22% of all electric power in 2040 plus. Right now, estimates that the world recoverable reserves in the world are about 1.16 trillion short tons of coal. And the greatest percentage of that coal is found here in the United States. We still have vast supplies of coal. We also have dry natural gas, which is essentially methane. We have wet natural gas, which is gas that has lower percentage of methane and other gases still burnable. That coal and gas is being produced principally in Pennsylvania, in the Permian area of Texas, and other areas, the Barnett shale. Wherever shale deposits are found in America is where we're producing most of that natural gas, and to some extent coal. Based upon, this may be the most important slide in this presentation, right now we have enough coal reserves that if we burn coal in conventional coal plants, we'd have enough energy for 470 years of electric energy if we burn them in conventional plants. In coal gasified plants, we have higher efficiency than this, and we have enough natural gas to last some 98 years. So I want to stop here for a second. What we're hearing from the administration is, on this Green New Deal, is that the climate crisis is so immediate that if we don't do something in 10 years, Charleston is going to be underwater. And New York is going to be an island, really an island. And Miami will disappear. I want to say to you that I believe those fears are overstated. And even if they were true, there are things we can bring upon ourselves that are worse than climate change if we devolve our economy and devolve our energy resources at the rate we're doing now. I mean, think about it. Look at what happened in Ukraine with Putin. What do you think that was about? How did he manage to intimidate Europe? And it was through energy dependence upon the Russians. Energy is not some neutral thing that we do to just make the climate better. Changes in energy mean changes in economies. They mean changes in strategic relationships. They mean changes in military capacity across the world. So it's risky for us to precipitously devolve our energy capacity. At the same time, we know that our arch rival, China, is ramping it up, and they're ramping it up on the very energy that we're turning from. So my argument is that it is imperative that we pursue a greener new world. It's imperative that we pursue better energy sources that are sustainable over time. But it's also imperative that we not cripple ourselves as an economy, as a democracy, and especially in terms of our strategic relationships by precipitously devolving our energy capacity, which we're doing at a rapid rate. Clean coal technology. Clean coal technology is being developed here in the US, and it's especially being developed in Europe and in China. Clean coal technology, in a nutshell, because I'm not the engineer, there's probably one in here that can say this better than me. Clean coal technology principally involves taking coal, slurring it, gasifying it, and then using the syngas off of the coal to power turbines. And then taking the particulates and the slag and the rest of what's involved produces pollutants from that, and in some cases injecting it in the ground, in other cases burning it again so that it does not leave nearly the amount of pollutants in the air. Clean coal technology, there's a plant in Tampa being operated by TECO right now. There's a plant in Indiana that's being operated. I think there's also one in New Mexico. So this is an evolving technology, but it's actually being pursued more seriously abroad than it is here in the US. This is also called Integrated Coal Gasification Combined Cycle, or IGCC. If you get a chance and you go to the web, you can look that up and you can see the technology and where that's being worked on. Now, this is not a fully developed technology. This is an evolving technology, but it's one that has demonstrated that you can take coal and you can more safely burn it than you could have under any other circumstance. And it means also that if you more efficiently burn coal, you have reserves that last longer than 470 years. You can use them over a longer period of time. And indeed, syngas can be used to power transportation and vehicles. So it's in addition to gasoline-powered engines and electric vehicles, there's also a capacity to have vehicles that are powered by syngas and natural gas. So you have other alternatives in your energy mix than we're looking at right now. I'm going to flip through that. I can't explain that picture at all, especially from this distance. My glasses are thicker, but when you get a chance, you can look at it. So we have plants in Tampa, Reno, Evansport, Indiana. These plants are being developed in Spain and in the Netherlands. They're being developed in Japan, but mostly they're being developed in China because China is using a lot of coal and they need to use it as efficiently as possible. Now here in South Carolina, we're blessed that we use a lot of nuclear. And that's just the other option that has to be on the table. It's crazy we're not building nuclear plants. We've got them around us. A green new future can't happen. Can't happen in the long run without nuclear. Nuclear has got to be there. Indeed, I would argue that clean coal technology is also a bridge fuel to a new future. Even though we have enough to probably last for 470, maybe 500 years or more using that energy, in the long run, those sources of fuel will be depleted, and nuclear is the place we need to be. And it's not really on the table at all. There's our state. Those are the nuclear power plants that are fueling us. We got the one right across the river in Georgia, Catawba, Robinson, Oconee, Sumner, and we've got Vogtle, which I think is the closest nuclear plant to us, which is right across the river from us. This picture really kind of spells out what our problem is. We're moving to a world in which we've got a little bit of renewable energy generation and a huge appetite for energy in our system. Think about this. Without energy, you would have poverty, you would have ill health, you'd have social disruption, you'd have military expansionism. Energy is at the heart of maintaining our nation and our society as it is. We can use energy more efficiently, but it's not realistic to think that we're going to go on an energy diet and at the same time grow and maintain our economy. It's just not going to happen. We need energy. Our society needs it. We have to have sustainable energy. Right now, the Department of Energy found that 70% of U.S. transmission lines are 25 years or older. And the last infrastructure review was in 2015. It's estimated that we would need at least $1 trillion overhaul of our electric system to bring it up to speed. At the same time that we're talking about producing electric vehicles and charging stations all over the country to put more load. At the same time, we're selling solar panels to put on top of roofs of homes that will increase the charge that go over the grid. At the same time we're doing that, we're really not doing anything to truly modernize the grid. Look at the increase from 2019 to 2020 of blackouts and brownouts. They're becoming more common. We should see them probably out west soon with the demise of the reservoirs out there that are producing energy. Siting new transmission lines is a nightmare from a regulatory perspective. Remember earlier I showed you all the organizations that are involved, providers, overseers, the federal government, state governments, the EPA, the nuclear, all of these players are a part of this. So if you want to rationalize and improve the grid system, just imagine the regulatory nightmare it takes to go through to do this, which is one of the things Republicans should think about in a presentation like this. Don't be surprised if one day some very kind Democratic president says, oh, to protect the country, to make sure that the country has energy and that energy is secure in America, we're going to federalize the grid. I'm serious. You're going to hear that one day, and the day you hear it is the day that your freedom is gone. The day that any government can regulate and control the nation's energy is the day that you have entered a despotic government for sure. That simply cannot happen. One of the things that we have to be clear about as Republicans and conservatives is that we never allow, in the name of efficiency, for one agency or for the federal government to completely take over energy, because if it does, that day our freedom is gone. Just look at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now, and you get a sense of it. So we have to reform a Byzantine system, and especially if we're going to use EVs, and there's some changes that need to be made. The first one is, I think we have to abandon the Green New Deal as it's presented now in this terrible piece of legislation that was just passed. We have to get real. We have to change. We have to start this process of moving toward renewable fuels and to a greener, better future. But it takes time. It's going to take more than one administration to do it. It's going to take the work of many, many systems to do it. But we have to begin there. And the first thing we have to recognize, I would argue, is that if we want a greener future, we've got to do something about the grid. The grid is not going to be able to handle that new future unless we invest in it. We need to expand nuclear electric power. We should have done it a long time ago. Here, I don't think there'll be any argument in Aiken County that makes sense. We need to be doing that. We need to follow the lead of Georgia and Florida and start using more biomass for energy production. Did you know Georgia leads the nation in biomass for fuel production? And especially with the problems all of us are having with landfills and sanitary landfills, biomass, burning biomass becomes another fuel source that we can use to fuel the grid. And we need to pursue renewables to include hydroelectric and solar, but to do it a balanced way with the rest of the fuel resources we have. Instead of saying we've got these resources we're not going to use, and these that are nice green ones we are going to use, we need to use all of the above. We use what available energy we have and use it as efficiently as we can. We have to revive the nation's grid to develop effective interstate compacts designed to invest funding needed to modernize and expand the grid. I'm surprised this isn't used more. You've been, Mr. Pettigrew, you've been in the state legislature? Years ago, but you'll understand what I'm about to say. States sometimes come together to do things together that they can't do individually. Interstate compacts are wonderful ways for states to come together to do things like address the grid. They could do it, and it's better to have that happen locally with your state government than it is to have some federal agency do it for you. So interstate compacts are really something that should be considered in this whole process, especially when you have in our area, we have, used to be Georgia Power, it's now the Southern Company, that covers what, 4 or 5 states. It goes from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, parts of South Carolina, up into Tennessee. So we have already an infrastructure corporately that we could build upon in that way. We need to simplify utility regulation and rate setting. Now this is controversial. States like to set the rates for their states. But if you went to interstate compacts, you could simplify the rate structure a whole lot by having states agree, 2 or 3 states coming together in a compact, what those rates are going to be at any time. That would help simplify it. We need to improve the interconnectivity nationwide to avoid blackouts and brownouts, especially in the Republic of Texas. They might need to join the rest of us here. God love them, but we just don't want to see them go through what they went through, what they may go through again. We got to harden the grid. Have you ever thought about how vulnerable the grid is? There's an interesting CBS special done not long ago that said that it would only take an attack on about 20 substations in America to shut down the entire grid. We're gonna have to get real about that. Our grid, and that's not just the electric grid, it's also our natural gas resources. They're both extremely vulnerable, so we need to harden them. We need to rethink electric vehicles. Electric vehicles play a role in what we need in the future. But when we rely upon electric vehicles, the components of which have to be mined and delivered from countries that are hostile to us. Think about that, supply chain issues that we've had. Then we've got issues. And also if you go to Peru and you go to other nations where they're harvesting the material, especially lithium and other stuff for batteries, and you see the permanent damage that's done there, that's not going to be able to be fixed again, then you have to start asking questions about justice. Is it just for poor nations to have their land raped so that you and I can drive a Tesla here? I say that because only Democrats can ask that question. Of course, we Republicans, we don't have any sense of ethics like that at all to ask that question. But it's worth asking anyhow. We have to recognize that EVs will never completely replace our current gasoline engines. We're going to have to find some other ways of transportation and options. So, also along this, we need to replace aged refineries. We have a lot of oil. We can't make enough gasoline because our refineries are old. Exxon Mobil are saying they're not planning to build any new refineries given the regulatory environment nationally. It's no point in it. Why would they build a new refinery when Washington is hostile? We're going to need gasoline for a while. We're going to need gasoline for a while. We're going to need all those fuels for a while, so we need to be encouraging the replacement of refineries, expand their capacity, invest in smart grid technology so that we're more efficiently and effectively managing the grid across the country. We should be producing autos that are fueled by natural gas and syngas if we can make use of coal. We should pursue clean coal technology to gasify coal and put the same emphasis on that we do on developing nuclear, because frankly the costs are about the same. It's about as costly to develop a coal gasification plant as it is to build a nuclear one. And then we look for additional fossil resources. So we need a long-term plan to renewables. And this is where I'm pessimistic. I've worked on Capitol Hill. I do not believe we have the political apparatus of either party in place now to think more than 2 years or 4 years down the line. If that. And this is a problem that's going to take us much longer to resolve. I'm not sure how we're going to find the political will to do it. But this, if we're going to survive this, we need to be thinking 15, 20 years down the line. This is a long-term endeavor. I'm not sure politically how we do it in this environment. That's my great pessimism about this. But it's going to need to happen. We need to develop public and private partnerships with energy companies. I'll say this briefly. I got a little put out at my denomination. I'm Presbyterian. I am very put out with them. And this, as a matter of fact, they decided they would take all their investments out of energy companies because they didn't like the pollution they were doing in the world. Who the hell do you think is going to develop new energy but energy companies? So that's not smart. It's not smart to do that. We need to be in partnership with energy companies and not demonize them. And then we need to be using we need to apply the principles of highly reliable organizations when we're doing any of this. So that's that's like, in the Army we call that a blippet. That's 20 pounds of poop in a 5-pound bag. So I'm sorry that I gave you that much.
Any questions?
Got quite a few. As someone who invested part of his career on Capitol Hill, what percent?
We can't hear you.
As someone who invested part of his career on Capitol Hill, what percent of the 535 representatives understand this crisis, and what about the South Carolina delegation?
I've actually probably got more faith in the South Carolina delegation than I do most of them. You know, I was on the Hill in '89 and '90, and we had the ability to fight like the Dickens on the floor of the House and Senate and be civil to each other when we got off. You know, used to do that. Don't do that anymore. I don't think most of the representatives have a clue about this. I don't think they have a clue about most policy issues, to be honest with you. What Congress has done that has become dangerous for us is that Congress has developed a huge staff of people that service, if you will, senators and representatives over many years and different parties. And these people have more of the expertise on these topics than the members do themselves. So I'm not optimistic that we have many members that fully understand this. Although, you know, Senator Inhofe was one that understood the energy issue very well because he was on energy for many years. I think that Tim Scott is very knowledgeable about this stuff. I think Lindsey's probably pretty knowledgeable about this, but I can't speak to the rest.
You talked a little bit about the grid. What's the chances of the entire grid going down, and what do we do if it does?
I think the chances of the entire grid going down are very, very good. In part because it's old, it's vulnerable. It's vulnerable to terrorist attacks. It's very vulnerable. Because it's fueled by so many energy sources. You're already seeing it out west. The hydroelectric is not working out west. I think that it's very vulnerable, and my worry about coal is the more of these coal and natural gas and nuclear plants that we take offline, the less capacity we have and the more vulnerable that the grid is. So I'm very concerned about the grid.
This is a little bit of a continuation. Knowing the problems and challenges of energy and the grid, along with suggestions to change and solve our grid situation, what easy, simple, thought-provoking questions might we ask?
Wow, I don't know if I can answer that. I don't know if I can answer that, because this is complex. Every once in a while in a democracy, you run up on issues that you can't solve in a soundbite, and you can't solve with a commercial. This is requiring some heavy lifting, and frankly, my pessimism is the rancor between the parties is so bad now. I'm really concerned how we sit down and solve these basic problems. I wish I knew. Maybe it would be solved if we just called them nastier names.
If a national energy policy in Washington changes in 2 years, can the closed coal plants be reopened efficiently? There's another, China's not on board with green policy, similar to the U.S. Does their environmental harm negate our clean energy, the clean energy we produce?
Yeah, we're effectively in an economic war with China. I think it's time to just wake up. We're effectively in an economic war, and when you're in an economic war, you don't take your gun and unload it. You just don't take that kind of stance. Once these plants are closed, reopening them is an issue. Many of the plants are closing because they're aged. We have this problem across our infrastructure, not just in energy, but also in industry, that we have plants that we've allowed to get old, and we're just going to have to replace them. It's cheaper right now to replace them with solar and wind than it is with coal or nuclear, and that's part of the reason what we're doing. And from a political perspective, if you're on the left, it just pushes all the right buttons. I've got my green T-shirt on. We're the good party. This is the bad party here. But the reality of it is that you got to be investing and sinking the money into that more expensive infrastructure to keep your energy system going. It's just, we've got to do it.
Has free will been lost in the modern day, and is the future predetermined? How much do we determine our own futures? And what would happen if an EMP bomb was exploded over the U.S.? Everyone knows the problems. What's the solutions?
There's people in this room that know that better, that if one were exploded over us, we'd be back in the 1700s overnight. We can't afford to have that happen. But part of hardening the grid can be hardened to withstand that. That's yet another set of concerns that need to be built into looking at the grid.
I guess that's it. These other ones are kind of duplicates of
Okay.
what we've already asked. So thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, can I just remind you?
Sure.
Tomorrow is so bad, I don't think you can leave. Would you define biomass, just set a baseline?
Well, in Georgia, biomass can mean anything that you're burning. In Georgia, they're burning everything from garbage to wood chips. And anything that can be dried and burned is considered biomass. Now, of course, the problem with biomass is the carbon dioxide that comes, the particulate you can screen for, but you're going to have carbon dioxide come out the chimney. I don't want to get into a deep conversation with this because this always gets me in trouble. I'm not really, as an environmental person, I'm not really sure that carbon dioxide that is taken up in trees and grass and everything around us and that we expel with every breath, I'm not yet convinced it's the poison that a lot of people think it is. But that just makes me a Neanderthal, so.
Okay. Then my next point would be extended batteries.
Yeah,
These batteries don't last forever.
that's right.
How long typically would you say they last? And then the follow-on, what the hell do you do with them?
Well, those are both good questions, and the answer to both is we really don't know yet. I do know that when your electric car vehicle battery dies, I hear that it costs more to replace the vehicle than the battery than it did the vehicle itself. So this is another concern. And by the way, solar cells are the same issue. The more solar cells that we have, at some point we got to be thinking about where we dispose of them and where we recycle them. We really haven't thought this out. I guess this is my major problem that I'm making with the presentation. Why are we getting in our Tesla and revving it up to max speed to take off down into a future that we haven't planned and that we haven't made room for? So I don't know.
Well, and sort of a follow-on to that, the blades on the wind turbines.
Yeah.
My understanding is they don't last that long.
They don't, and they also are a huge environmental problem, especially for migratory birds. I haven't mentioned solar panels. You've seen that huge solar field that's out there on I-20, you know, you've got them around. What do you think that does to the habitat where you find a solar field like that? You don't have any animals there anymore. You don't have any plants there anymore. You don't have, even the rain that falls from the sky doesn't absorb into the aquifer as effectively as it does on anything else. So building solar fields is also, it's not a no loss situation. You're giving up something. I think maybe that's the difference between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans understand there's no free lunch. Everything has a cost. Everything is a trade-off. But the Green New Deal and what you're having sold is, it's a utopia.
And the last point on that is, my understanding is, there's no good way to dispose of these wind blades that go down very quickly.
No.
They just get what? Buried?
We don't know.
Can I please? make a
Please.
comment? I've worried about this problem a long time, and I've got some experience in dealing with Mike as well. And
Mike.
what you said is true, and it's even more complicated than what you. Did you hear what I said?
No.
I said, I know about this problem. I've been dealing with it for a long time. Back in the 60s, I was involved in hardening our military systems against EMP. Someone has that problem. And we are very vulnerable. And the most important thing, in my judgment of what you said, is how complicated it is. And furthermore, most of the grid is not part of the bulk power grid, which is what you're talking about.
It's distribution.
It's part of the distribution grid, which is managed by several thousand little companies. Municipal, South Carolina has basically three, 40 something.
Yeah.
We have 3 bulk power grid operators. And because of this complexity, I concluded years ago that unless we work this problem from the bottom up, it is so complicated it'll never get worked. I know how to do that. And it's not all that complicated, but getting Washington to agree is practically impossible. And the way the bureaucracy works is they want Washington in charge.
Yeah.
And there are processes underway right now to take over the management of the entire grid out of Washington.
That's right.
He mentioned FERC and NERC. Those are principally associated with the power plants and the long distance transmission lines. There are several thousand little companies that really manage the 90% of the grid that delivers electricity to customers. And they are throughout the country. And the only way you're going to deal with this problem is if people like in this room understand enough about it that they demand to their representatives that it be dealt with. We have one representative in South Carolina that understands this issue, and it's Ralph Norman. And his district includes York County, where we worked the problem and what it would cost to protect the grid up there, all of it, including, in that case, Duke Energy's part. You can't get Washington to deal with it.
Yeah.
So I'm telling you, unless you deal with it locally and get involved and understand it and demand your representatives to deal with it, it'll never be
So
solved.
that's the reason I suggested the interstate compacts. I lived in Texas long enough to learn that you shouldn't trust any more government than you can put up with. The state legislatures and the state governments can enter into interstate compacts, which would allow us to address this more locally. I'm with you. I don't, if it's addressed out of Washington, I see tyranny coming out of this. I only see tyranny coming out of it, so.
They're from the federal government and they're here to help, right?
Yeah, always. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you coming to speak to us.